Well, thank you everybody for joining us. Hello, my name is Jennifer Summers. I'm the Program Development Specialist with the Wisconsin Center for Wildlife. And today I'm introducing the Living with Wildlife seminar series. Today, Scott Hygnstrom is going to be presenting, but this seminar series is part of the Wildlife 100 class. And the Wildlife 100 course is a course that is designed for students to learn more about wildlife and human-wildlife interactions. And this is open to all UW-SP students. And so we're honored that you have chosen to join us today. And we'd like to thank you again for joining us. So whenever we have a public gathering at UW-SP, this includes virtual gatherings, we like to take a moment to honor the native peoples that once occupied this land. So we recognize that the University of Wisconsin Stevens Point occupies lands of the Ho-Chunk and Menominee people. Please take a moment to acknowledge and honor the ancestral Ho-Chunk and Menominee land and the sacred land of all Indigenous peoples. So I'd like to start by, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, and it's Dr. Scott Hygnstrom. And Scott is the director of the Wisconsin Center for Wildlife. He is also a professor and the Douglas R. Stevens Endowed Chair in Wildlife. And he is also an extension wildlife specialist. So some of you that are in the class are probably already know Dr. Hygnstrom, but today he has been managing the Southern African internship program for 5 years, and he's been directing the Wisconsin Center for Wildlife since 2014. So I'd like to take a moment again to please introduce and welcome Scott Hygnstrom and thank him for presenting today. And Scott, take it away.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Thank you, Berlin, for helping background scenes. I appreciate all the efforts on this. And I'll welcome everyone to this Living with Wildlife seminar series. This is the first of our seminars that we're contributing this semester, and we have 4 that are coming up, starting out with mine. And next week we'll have John Organ speaking at the same time, Tuesday at 4 to 5 o'clock. And John will be talking about the North American model of wildlife conservation. He's actually one of the architects of the North American model. So we're kind of honored to be able to have John come to speak with us next week. After that, in early April, Berlin Brecke, one of our own, she's going to be talking about a project she has with the Adopted Wildlife Area Programs with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources and Grassland Management. And then we'll be wrapping up the seminar series with Adrian Weideman in late April, and he'll be talking about wolf management in Wisconsin. So we have a pretty interesting lineup, and they all fit this theme of living with wildlife and the various modules that we have as we work through this semester with that Wildlife 150 class. So I welcome all of them here. I also welcome the students from my wildlife damage management class. Wildlife 348, I said I'd give them a little extra credit if they show up here, because the focus of that class really deals with North American species. I don't have time to get to some of the other global species, and this is an opportunity that they can chime in on it as well. So I appreciate everyone joining us. And with that, I'm going to share my screen and start up with the PowerPoint that I have. All right, so I'm hoping everyone can see this screen. It starts with the title of Save Me from the Lion's Mouth, our efforts to promote human-wildlife coexistence in Southern Africa. And I start with this title. The phrase "save me from the lion's mouth" is actually a phrase from a prayer, an African prayer. And it maybe indicates some of the gravity of the situation we have to speak of as far as coexisting with wildlife in Southern Africa. It's fairly significant issues here that we're dealing with. But I'd like to keep the seminar somewhat light. And so today I'm going to start with a photo safari of some of the experiences I've had in Southern Africa. Then we'll move on and we'll talk about the coexistence aspect of humans and wildlife. And then later we'll talk about some of the experience we've had with our students from UW-Stevens Point in Southern Africa. And we'll wrap it up in that way. So I want to chat about human-wildlife coexistence. I see it in a sense as a bit of a balance in our life, in that with our wildlife resources, We have just abundant wildlife resources in Africa, and the beauty is incredible. And we reap many, many benefits from the wildlife that are there as far as aesthetics and ecological and scientific benefits, etc. But on the other side of this balance, there are issues for the people who live in Southern Africa, who have to deal with, in many cases, venomous snakes with large African predators and some really large animals that can cause a lot of damage. And so their lives really are in the balance as far as living in Africa. And we oftentimes reap the benefits as, on our photo safaris and our viewing of wildlife there. But the people who have to live there on a day-to-day basis, their experiences sometimes are a little different. But we'll get into that when we talk about coexistence. To give you an idea of where we're talking about, the issue of Southern Africa, this is this region here to the southern part of Africa. It encompasses Namibia, Botswana, South Africa, Tanzania, Mozambique, this region of Africa. And I've traveled in most of these countries, but most of our student experiences are in the northern part of Botswana, up here in this region we call the Okavango Delta, and in some of the sideline landscapes in that vicinity. So that's roughly where we're coming from. As far as what you see, the photo safari, this is kind of the fun side of this presentation. I love lugging a camera along. There's so much beauty there to be seen and captured that I like to be able to start off this presentation this way. It's one of the things that's unique about Africa. It's such a large continent, and it is so incredibly diverse. The diversity of the environments are just stunning. And so you can go from the Namib Desert, for example, here, where it's a stark contrast, where you have maybe 2 inches of rainfall a year, down to what we know as the Okavango Delta in northern Botswana, where it's actually a river that runs, the Angola River, that runs into the Kalahari Desert, and it flattens out and it creates this huge, huge delta. And think of that for a moment. It's a river that runs into a desert and then spreads out and disappears. I usually think about a river running into an ocean and forming a delta, but it's a totally different environment. And when you add water to a desert environment, it's incredibly rich, and the wildlife is just amazing. Along with the diverse landscapes that are there, you have incredible diversity with wildlife. And so I show this image just to show the number of species of ungulates we have here alone across this landscape is quite extensive, with the springbuck, plains zebra, the elephants, there's kudu, there's oryx, there's hartebeest, and there's wildebeest. As I look at this, you keep on popping up with more and more species. And then as well, there's the bird diversity of those flamingos that you see in the unique colors with those species. The big five, what's the big five? Well, my students in Wildlife 150 should be able to answer that question. We've been talking for the last week about ecotourism, and the big five are the species really that people go to now to Southern Africa to see. These are the big five species: the elephant, the lion, rhino, the buffalo, the African buffalo, and then the leopard. These are the big five species that everybody just wants to see. And for some, unfortunately, if they don't see all of these five species, it's like they've wasted their time, or, oh, that was a terrible trip, we didn't see them all. And that is really unfortunate, I will say. Of the big five, the elephants seem to be everywhere, especially in Botswana. They're actually quite overabundant. The leopards are everywhere. However, the leopards are what I consider the silent stalker. And this is the toughest one for most people to see. And maybe something on the order of 5% of the visitors, 5 to 10% of the visitors actually see a leopard. So with the big five, this is a challenge to get all of them, because leopards are so secretive. You just don't get to see them very often. I will say that the big five, and in talking with my Wildlife 150 class, we talked about ecotourism last week. This week, we're talking about consumptive uses of wildlife. And the big five, that name probably got its start in the world of hunting. And so for a couple of centuries, Europeans especially, but more recently, people from all over the globe have been going to Africa to go hunting. And the biggest challenging species to go for are these very same big five. And so the big five is a name that probably got its start within the hunting communities there, as far as these were highly sought after species for hunters, but also they still are highly sought after species for those photosafarists and ecotourists. But the big five, that's not all there is to see in Africa. There's just so much diversity in the wildlife that's there. And ungulates, I teach a course in ungulate ecology. These are the hooved mammals. And so, of course, I've got to be interested in these species. And so we have a plains zebra here. We have kudu, springbuck, the blue wildebeest, and we have a black-faced impala. This is actually an endangered species in Southern Africa. And then the last one I have to share with you would be the giraffe. Who could go to Africa without seeing a giraffe? They're actually fairly widespread, but their numbers are of concern. The numbers are declining. This just shows a small part of the biodiversity of ungulates in Africa. Looking at this chart, you can see the wide range of species that actually do exist in Africa and in various parts of Africa. I will say they're not all in Southern Africa, but there's just incredible biodiversity of ungulates in this country. But just not stopping at ungulates or the mammals world, there's the bird life as well. So many bird species. And one thing that's so striking is the colors of the birds that you find in Africa. So this is one of my favorite, oops, I go over here. The lavender roller is the name of this one. Just incredibly iridescent colors. And as they spread out their wings, a blue and white, highly contrasting color. The wood hoopoe here, which is a bird that will wake you up in the mornings with their call, the hoopoo, hoopoo type call. The scarlet tanager or excuse me, that's our species. This is a scarlet shrike, the scarlet shrike that is there, and that red is just blazing red, really, really eye-catching. And then we have a species here that many of you actually recognize, and this would be the helmeted guinea fowl. And so we've actually imported guinea fowl into North America, and they're found on a lot of farms, but it actually has its origination in Africa. But so many other bird species that we could have, and there's sunbirds and a variety of really, really impressive, colorful birds that are there. But moving on, there's so much to see in Africa. The plant life, I think that's fascinating as well. And one of the unique aspects about the plant life in Africa is that most of it seems to have thorns. And why? Well, it's because there's so many ungulates over there. They've developed these physical barriers with these thorns to try and ward off herbivory. But there's just an incredible diversity of plant life that's over there. Acacia is a major shrubland type species, camel thorn, various grassland species that are there. And I raised this image that's a really pretty unique tree, and I just had to feature it. It's known as the baobab tree. The baobab is, to some people, it's the tree that grows upside down. And as you might see, it kind of looks like a tree that actually has its roots sticking out of the ground. It is an immense tree. If you look at the girth of this one, it rivals some of our sequoias. And it actually is a monocotyledonous type plant. And so it's unique in its nature, it's unique in its function. The elephants seem to have a bit of a penchant for them. So you can see this tree is heavily scarred by the rubbing of elephants over the years. And it's just a fascinating tree species. And it's actually kind of rare. In the Okavango Delta, the first time I dropped off there, we were talking with people and they said there's 231 baobab trees in the Okavango Delta. This is the fellow that was doing research on them. And by the time we left, the elephants had taken one down. They just constantly rub and scratch, and they're curious about them. They feed on them, and so there were only 230 baobab trees left. But fortunately, they are reproducing as well. Chat briefly about the accommodations. Part of life in Africa is where you live, and I've spent many a night in a thatched roof type hut or a lodge. And on one end, and you can go on to the upper end, you can spend a night in a high-rise apartment or a hotel in Durban, South Africa. Most of my nights, however, have been spent in this type of accommodation within tents. Now, mind you, these are really nicely appointed tents. You can see the bunks that they have. They even have hot water bottles. There's a loo or a bathroom in the back, along with showers. I mean, they're very, very nicely appointed. But whichever way you slice it, in the middle of the night, when you hear shuffling around outside and you're not sure what it is, that's a pretty thin-walled structure you're sleeping in. And elephants oftentimes will visit camps, and they're looking for food, and they're familiar with the territory. But we've had lions visit camps. Hyenas come in on occasion, and boy, there's nothing like trying to fall asleep with an elephant 3 feet from your head. And that essentially is the situation here. This is a camel thorn tree right here. Elephants eat the pods of camel thorn trees, and this elephant was coming up, and it would butt this tree in the middle of the night. It was butting this tree. Camel thorns would rain down on the top of the tent, and then you'd hear that trunk snuffling around, picking up camel thorn pods, while my head is right there, 3 feet away from the animal. A little disconcerting, leads to a little bit of loss of sleep at night. I mean, you're pretty anxious when something like that goes on, but it's living in Africa, it's just something you learn to live with. Fascinating experiences, though. As far as looking at another angle of life there, transportation, how do you get around? Well, we've got the Kalahari Ferrari here with some of the more exotic travel, and we have just the regular commercial airlines. Yes, to get to Africa, it's about a 16-hour flight from Atlanta to Johannesburg, and then you get around in a variety of different ways. And by that, I'm meaning all kinds of different ways. Standard is a Land Cruiser. Standard operation is getting into Land Cruiser with these open type structures here. But oftentimes you'll be riding in a boat in the Okavango Delta. You may fly to get there. In fact, you might even be riding around a horse out in the veldt of Africa. So there's many, many different modes of transportation. So that kind of goes through life and a bit of a photo safari of Southern Africa for you. And now I'd like to move on to this whole concept about human-wildlife coexistence. And again, I use this balance symbol because the people who live in the veldt or in the bush or in the field, in the rural areas, in some respects, their lives are in the balance. If you look at their way of life of these villagers and their Himba, this is Herero, Setswana, oops, I should go here. Himba, Herero, Setswana, Bushmen. There are a variety of different tribes in Southern Africa. Many of them live out and away from these urban areas. They live out in villages, in small places. Many of them live in mud-type huts. They have corrals like this in which they keep their animals in at night to protect them from the large predators that are there. And you have to understand that their lifestyle is very different from ours. They don't have a grocery store just down the block that they can go to secure food. The only food that they have is what they can hunt or fish or gather and be able to preserve for their use throughout the year. Many of the people in Southern Africa are herding, are of a herding culture, and so they have their own livestock. But they will say that this is their bank account. The animals, the livestock that they have, that is what they have to depend upon for the rest of the year. They don't have essentially money in the bank. They have animals on the hoof, and that's what their wealth is. And so if they're losing animals to large predators, then they're losing wealth. And if they lose too much of that wealth, it may make it very, very difficult for them to survive. And so my point is that humans there live very close on the edge. Their lives are in a close balance with what's out there and going on in nature. And so it's up to us to work with them and figure out and help them to be able to coexist with the wildlife that is out there. One of the ways we can do this is by looking at human-wildlife conflicts. Those would be situations in which wildlife cause problems for people, whether they cause damage to their personal property, whether they threaten human health and safety, or potentially are involved in transmissions of disease, or in some cases just simply are a nuisance. But we need to look at these human-wildlife conflicts and figure out ways in which we might be able to help people who live in this constant exposure to the elements. There's an interesting book that was written by James Clark, 2012, and it's entitled "Save Me from the Lion's Mouth." That should look familiar to you. Exposing human-wildlife conflict in Africa. And what James Clark did, he was a reporter for one of the journals in Johannesburg, and he was enlightened about this issue about humans living out in the landscape and having to suffer the negative consequences of living with all of these wildlife, with lions, leopards, elephants, hippos. And so he started doing explorative work on this matter, doing reference journalism, and was looking at the records as best he could. And he came up with estimates of the number of human lives that are lost to wildlife out there in Africa. And it's rather shocking, I will have to say. And I'll reveal some of these numbers here in a little bit. But one of the major point that he was trying to make is that many of the people who live on the open veldt and live in close community with these animals, whether they're in association with national parks or not, oftentimes they don't gain much benefits from the wildlife that are there, but yet they certainly can be negatively impacted by the wildlife. And what James Clark was trying to point out is that it seems as though there's a growing divide, a widening chasm between the native people who live in Africa and the wildlife that live there as well. And he's very concerned about this because if wildlife loses their value to the people who live there, we then have a growing problem, because now the animals, if they have no value to the people, they'll be more easily cast off, or poaching might be more likely to occur. And just the casual killing of wildlife may occur. And in fact, in some cases, it may be retribution for the loss of livestock as to why many of the villagers may be killing lions, for example. And so there's a concern as far as the loss of human life and loss of resources in Africa to wildlife, but there's this growing loss of value of the wildlife as far as the negative impacts that there are on people that is of a concern. So I want to share with you some of the individual species that are a bit disconcerting, starting with lions. This is an image that I was able to take of two lions. These are two females at a waterhole, and it's part of a small pride of two males and two females that joined up. There were 2 and 2, they were split. When they came together, there was this roaring greeting going on. 2 of them were actually sitting on a dead elephant that they were feeding on it, and then 2 came back to join them. And it was fascinating. We were able to follow them around in the bush relatively safely in one of those open Land Cruisers. We were able to snap this picture, and it does kind of hearken to me of this image of Colonel Patterson. He was a colonel in the British military back in the early 1900s. And he was in charge, he was an engineer by trade, and he was in charge of building a railroad from the Indian Ocean on the east side of Africa in Mozambique, and build that railroad westward into the area known as Tsavo. And to do this, he employed many people from India who were laborers who worked for the British Army at the time. And he had a crew of laborers working there. They were laying ties and laying rails. They're moving through, and all of a sudden they came upon this area where there were 2 lions. And these lions, for whatever reason, they developed a taste for human flesh. And so every night, these 2 lions came in and they marauded and they killed people who were working on the railroad. So every night there were 1 or 2 people who were lost. And Colonel Patterson, it was his job to protect the workers. The workers actually stopped working. They were so fearful. And he had a rifle, and he lured those animals in. And in time, he had a lot of mistakes that went on, but there's a fascinating read. But nonetheless, he was able to kill these 2 lions and protect those Indian workers on the railroad. These 2 lions, not these 2 at the waterhole, but the 2 lions that he killed are now able to be viewed at the Shield Museum of Natural History in Chicago. The 2 lions are right there. As you walk in, you'll see them. But this is a fascinating read. And interestingly enough, there's another book that came out about early, what was it, 2010 or something like that, by a man by the name of Patterson. This time it was Bruce Patterson, not Colonel J.H. Patterson. But Bruce Patterson was a scientist working and a writer for National Geographic, and he wrote another book, The Lions of Tsavo, in which he was looking at Africa's most notorious man-eaters and chronicling those that have caused a great loss of human life. The Two Lions of Tsavo, of which there was a movie based on, Ghosts in the Darkness. It's a Mike Douglas movie. Some of you may have seen it. Those lions killed about 110 people in their marauding during a relatively short period of time. And Bruce Patterson goes on to write about speculating why these animals may have been the way they were. And I think a lot of it leads to potentially famine, in that their wild hoofed stock prey that they normally feed upon. In dry conditions, they can move much larger distances and much more quickly than the lions can. And so the lions simply run out of food, and then they turn on to humans. And so they've had these bouts of man-eaters, human eaters coming on and having circumstances where many human lives are lost. So that starts with the lions. You know, and many of us, we have that Disney perspective of the wildlife of Africa. We have this perspective of the king of the jungle, the lion. And the people who live there actually have more of a view of the lion in this way. I will have to say they view it as a marauding predator that causes losses of livestock and also loss of family members and humans in their villages. So there's a bit of a disconnect between perhaps our perspective of wildlife and theirs. Moving on though. Talk about leopards. I mentioned about them being the silent stalker, and they're an incredibly powerful animal, up to 200 pounds. I should mention the lions. They're known to get up to 600-700 pounds. They're really large creatures. But leopards are really incredible species themselves. This is a picture of a leopard that I was able to capture, take a photo of, I should say, in the let's see, Otjiwarongo area of northern Namibia. And I was with a friend of mine, and we went out for a game drive early in the morning. And you usually don't see leopards. And here's one leopard that's there just across the roadway from us. And we watched it. And this leopard was not shy at all. And it actually walked right up to our vehicle. Unfortunately, I'll say we weren't in an open Land Cruiser at the time. We were in a Range Rover with windows. And this leopard came up within 3 feet of my door, and it looked right in my vehicle at us. And then it walked around to the other side and looked right up at Christian. And Christian got some incredible photographs of this animal. But this seems to be abnormal behavior. But yet when we talked with people there, they said, no, this leopard, we had never fed it. We knew there was one in the area. But this seemed to be just a leopard that was big and bold and a dominant animal in its environment. Probably 175-pound animal and full of fury. We see leopards, perhaps these spotted little cat-like animals like this, but leopards in reality are incredibly strong and top-level predators in that environment. The book by James Clark, he chronicled an incident in Tanzania where a pair of leopards killed 635 people in a killing spree back in the late 1800s. Remarkable numbers that we might see, but these animals are incredibly powerful. They grab a 100-pound gazelle like this and can just carry it right up into the tree with them so that they can avoid scavengers and other predators. On to elephants. Toying with the big five idea yet. They're elephants. They're huge animals as big as a house, over 10,000 pounds. And this is a creature that can be rather formidable. I've been in a few close scrapes with elephants where we've been in a place where the elephants didn't like our vehicle there and we had bluff charges. But, from our Disney world, we have Dumbo, happy-go-lucky little guy like this. But this is the photo taken by a pair of Chinese who were visiting in Etosha. And this is a cow elephant that attacked their vehicle, rolled the vehicle several times, injured the people quite severely. And unfortunately, elephants lead to the loss of human life, maybe in the neighborhood of 200 people per year in Southern Africa, just because they're so large. The males go into a must period in which they're rather aggressive, and the females are aggressive in defending their calves. And so there are issues that occur with them. Hippos. This is a species that lives within the riverways, the river horse. And that too in Africa, Southern Africa, is where the people live because of the availability of water. And so you have this close commingling of hippos and people, and that can cause some significant issues. We see the Fantasia, rendition of a hippo like this, happy-go-lucky, but the hippo itself is actually a pretty fearsome animal. And it was estimated about 5,000 to 6,000 people lose their lives to hippos because of their close proximity, the proximity to the riverways, people paddling up and down in the rivers with their dugouts, and the hippos they have a temper. Christian, one of my friends, and I'll speak of him later, he has had some encounters with hippos where one actually tipped over his boat and rendered him, out in the Okavango Delta without a boat. Pretty serious conditions. I was motoring with a couple of people in the Okavango Delta, and we came to an open pod area where there were 4 hippos on the other end, and the male that was there submerged. And Maud, the guide who we were with, he stopped immediately and he said, "We must leave." And with that, he made a very quick, wide turn. And as he was roaring out of that hippopod, this male breached up out of the water and came crashing down within about 20 yards of the back end of our boat. This is something you take notice of when you're living and experiencing times in Africa. Thrilling experience. It's one that I'll never forget. But I see why people are very, very concerned about hippos in that environment. Crocodiles, here's another large predator that we must deal with in Africa. And again, about 5,000 to 6,000 people perhaps every year lose their lives to crocodiles because they live in proximity to those rivers. They get their water from the rivers. When they send little Johnny or Joni out to pick up water from the river, sometimes they don't return. And it seems like life there is so much more on the edge than we experience here in North America. It's just a different experience to deal with. We have Wally Gator here, the happy-go-lucky character, and in reality, you may have, say, a 15 to 20 foot now croc like this. One that an article or a story that I read in Clark's book was about one that killed 60 people in Mozambique, and it seemed as though it had actually developed a revenge attitudes towards people because it wasn't even consuming them. Something to deal with that environment. Snakes. I know some of you are kind of squirmy right now looking at a picture of a snake. This happens to be a puff adder that you see here. But the venomous snakes, there are quite a lot of them in Africa. And Clark estimated that about 10,000 people lose their lives to venomous snakes. The puff adder is a very lazy creature. It just lays around. If people happen to be walking out on trails at night, that's when they most often get bitten. We see snakes as, carefree types, but this is one that, I'm not afraid of much in the world, but this is a black mamba. And this is a creature that has a bit of an attitude as well. The adult males, they are territorial. And so therefore they will defend their territories and they'll chase. The bite is lethal. It's a systemic toxin as well as a hemolytic type toxin. And these snakes are quite large. An adult male can be 15 to 20 feet long with a head the size of my fist. And I've not experienced an interaction with a mamba, but I have a friend who did twice in hunts that he had been there, and another friend who saw one just streaked across the roadway in front as he was driving, and he had nightmares for days on end about black mambas. So there's some species to concern about. I will say that with these snakes, I've been talking about in the numbers of hundreds and thousands of people that lose their lives, but I might ask you this: what animal causes the greatest amount of loss of human life in Africa? It happens not to be a vertebrate. It is an invertebrate. It's the mosquito. How does the mosquito cause? Well, it's transmission of diseases that the mosquitoes are a disease vector. And so they estimate that a million people lose their lives in Africa because of mosquito-borne diseases. So just to help put things a little bit in perspective for you. Moving on, thinking about personal property, livestock that is out there. People live on these livestock. It's essentially their bank account. And when they have large predators like this, the lions, they can take any animal they wish. A domestic cow, cattle, bull, whatever. That's no challenge for an African lion at all. The image you see in the middle of a black-backed jackal, I like to think of them as kind of a coyote on steroids. They're really, really challenging predators to deal with. And the one at the top is the one that perhaps draws most ire from ranchers and farmers in Africa, and that is the cheetah. And the main reason is because the cheetah, they're built for speed. They're not built for defending their prey. And so they have to kill roughly every day to be able to survive. And so if they get into an area that they're killing livestock every day, that's where the landowners, the ranchers, farmers, they just don't accept those levels of losses. And so that's part of the reason why we have cheetahs as an endangered species, and they've been reduced across all of their range, is because of their interactions, the negative interactions they have with livestock producers. Going on to some of the crops that we deal with, and yes, these villagers, they do raise crops where they have enough water, and they too have to deal with wildlife damage issues, from marauding elephants to kalila birds that fly in vast numbers, to baboons that you might see out feeding upon corn that would be planted. So they deal with wildlife from seemingly all angles. And if you're ever driving on the roadways and you've seen these warning deer crossing signs, imagine the first time you see a sign like this, a warning as far as an elephant crossing sign. Wow, that catches your attention without question. So the picture I'm trying to paint here is that the problems as far as human-wildlife conflicts in Southern Africa, they really are pretty significant. When I think of all the work that I've done here in North America with people with bats in their attic or moles in the yard, or perhaps deer feeding on their cornfields, or even wolves taking livestock, those problems here in North America are probably at a magnitude of order lower than the problems that they deal with in Southern Africa, just because of the significance and loss of human life and the huge impacts, economic impacts that they have on their people. And so my point is, they have really significant problems. They have relatively limited resources to deal with them. Here we use high tensile electric fences if we want to fence animals out. There they may have only the availability of the native acacia vegetation, and they'll cut a lot of them with the thorns, and they'll put up what they call a boma, and this is to put their livestock in at night to protect them. That's about all they have. They have relatively limited education in many of these villages, limited government support. In many cases, it seems like the governments don't care about the people at all, unfortunately. And so there's little support there for dealing with wildlife problems, much less any economic returns or compensation associated with that. And so there's growing despair and anxiety in the people who live on the landscape out in the veldt in Africa. And that's again, harkening back to James Clark's perspective about this growing chasm between the people and the wildlife resources that we value so much. So what can we do about this? We have the Wisconsin Center for Wildlife. We started up a program back in 2015, and it's what I call the Southern Africa Human-Wildlife Coexistence Project. And there are many facets associated with this project, but I viewed the first one was networking. I needed to get to know the people who are working in Southern Africa and to find out what it is that they are actually doing. My first contact was Lori Marker here, who is the director of the the International Cheetah Foundation in northern Namibia. Spent time with her there, went back to teach a couple of classes that she has on a biodiversity course, an international biodiversity course. And there, Lori connected me with Christian and Hanli Vinderbach. They're two lion researchers who work in Botswana largely. And it was with them that I've started up these internship projects and other projects. Tico McNutt, worldwide expert on the African wild dog. Graham McCauley, who is associated with Elephant Eco program, one trying to resolve human-wildlife conflicts with elephants. But they're all people that work on the landscape, work with the villagers, people trying to resolve human-wildlife conflicts. So networking was so very, very important. With that, I was able to start this student internship program. And it was to get students from UW-Stevens Point over and to experience some of these things they do in Southern Africa. And let me say that I've been talking now about the loss of human life and the threats there by elephants, hippos, and all this other stuff going on. And yes, it exists. There is risk associated with spending time in Africa and Southern Africa. But I will say that we need to look at life from a perspective of relative risk. In that I've always said to the students and others, in that they were probably at greater risk driving from here to O'Hare Airport to board a plane than they were at any time that they were in Southern Africa. That's the most risky thing we do, is to get into a vehicle, and we do it casually every single day. And the statistics are there to prove it, as far as accidents and loss of human life and injury associated with driving vehicles. So I'm trying to put you a little bit at ease with the idea of sending students over there to work in Africa. We also do have 2 backup medical evacuation systems there. We have insurance coverage for the students that are there. I go through a training program with the students about expressing the risks that they may experience while there. They're also there with Christian Winterbach and his field assistants, who are very savvy in the field. They know the way to get along best in the wild world that's over there. And so I've always felt pretty comfortable, and I've gone over with most of the teams of interns as well. So I've been able to help them in the field get adjusted and get to know the things that they need to avoid. They don't go out at night. They don't go jogging on roadways. Those are some things you just don't do in Southern Africa. And largely you don't get out of your vehicles either, because there's risk out there with these large animals. And I do want them to be safe when they're over there. So with that, there's just incredible experiences that these students gain in education. We get them involved in collaborative research with the scientists over there, and they come away with these life experiences. And every one of the students that's been to Africa has just come back just marveling at how it's expanded their life in the experiences they've been able to enjoy. So here's a list of the students that we've been able to send over the last 5 years. The first names that you see on these lists from 2015 through 2019 were project assistants. These are students that I hired to assist me from 3 to 6 months with these projects. So Emmy Keno, Emma Doden, Carol White, and Tim Zappa, and Abby Ewert, they did a fantastic job in helping to facilitate our student interns when they were over there. And they were there as well and worked on projects. And then the long list of students we have here, there's 14 students that we've sent over to gain experience there. The most recent ones were 2019 with Tommy Young and Nate Weisenbeck. I know Nate is out there in the audience. Tommy, he had another meeting with students he wasn't able to get out of, but hopefully Nate will be able to chime in a little bit when I wrap things up. But many of these have gone on to graduate school and working with Fish and Wildlife Service. They've gone on to do great things, and it's been really fun to be just a little small part of their past life experiences. I do want to acknowledge my friend, Christian Winterbach here. Christian, he's the owner of Tau Consultants, and he's a lion researcher there in northern Botswana. And he's the go-to person that I connect with as far as setting up all of these internship experiences with my students in Southern Africa. Essentially, we send students over, the interns over, for a 6-week period, and it oftentimes integrates with their summer field experiences up at Tree Haven. Whereas the project coordinators, the students here front and center on the list, they're over there for the entire 12-week period through the summer. And then they get to come back, but just looking at some of their experiences that they have, they live in tents in the field. They spend oftentimes a week at a time out in the field collecting data, and then they'll come back and they refuel, resupply themselves, and then they go right back out in the field and spend time out with data collection. Much of data collection is done from a vehicle, and so they're driving transects and they're looking for spoor or tracks of predators and their prey species. And they're also doing distance sampling. And so you see up here with binoculars, and they have rangefinders, and every single animal that they see that might be food for a lion or a leopard or a cheetah, from a dik-dik to an elephant, they're recording the size, the sex and age of the animal, and the distance to that animal. And through that, we're able to come up with estimates of the densities of these prey species that are out there in the environment. With the track counts or the spore counts, they're able to come up with indices to the number of predators predators that are out there in the environments. And so with that, I have to acknowledge our native trackers and guides that we have there that we work with. Get my cursor here, Vera here and Julius here. And we've had others in the past, but they've been just totally instrumental and invaluable in helping us with all of the tracking work that is done to identify species, the sex and age of the species, to get an idea of where and when they were there. It's just incredible, the native traditional ecological knowledge that these people have and that they've learned by growing up in the bush, and they're able to convey that over to the students so that they eventually learn a little bit about tracking and identifying all the wildlife. Their skills are really quite remarkable, and we wouldn't be anywhere without the help of the natives who have worked with us. So the students get into these collaborative research projects, and with Christian, he's involved in doing these predator indices and prey biomass estimates. So this is looking at the interaction between predator-prey out there in northern Botswana. And we're also looking at complaints, number of livestock depredations that occur, and essentially trying to figure out the integration of those. And with the hypothesis that if there's adequate wild hoof stock that is available, ungulates, the wild ungulates there, they will serve as a buffer to depredation on the livestock that might be present, and to therefore minimizing the number of livestock losses. And so this whole idea is trying to find ways in which the people can coexist with these large African carnivores in their own environment. Students, they also get to embark on some of their own individual projects in addition to the transect and distance sampling work that they do. And so they've worked on a variety of different things, from cameras to photogrammetry to looking at scat, to looking at giraffes, to elephants, to lions, a wide range of different projects that they've gotten involved in. So they set up their own projects, they develop their own hypotheses, figure out the methodology, and then they go out and they collect the data. And then they bring those data back and they hammer through and they analyze their data. And the end result is I have to say, they also learn in doing research in that it's not always easy. And that there's always foibles that occur, flat tires and broken down vehicles and engines and springs, et cetera. Things happen in the field when you're doing research. It doesn't always go your way. And hopefully they learn from that experience as well, and learn to adapt and develop these problem solving skills, in which enable them in the future to become better researchers. So I'll just have to point out the pointer puppy that there is one that follows along quite often on slide tours like this. So when they do get back home, they're able to crunch the numbers and do data analysis. And I just put a couple of posters and one presentation up here just to illustrate that they've done over 24 presentations or poster presentations of the work that they've done in Africa. And so Tim Zappa's poster here on looking at data on identifying individual lions. Here's the one by Tommy Young and Nate Weisenbeck about their elephant photogrammetry, where they took photos of elephants, measured those animals using photogrammetry, and then came up with sex ratios and age classes associated with the elephants that they were able to observe. Really great population dynamics, basic information they're able to contribute. And then doing survey work, as we've mentioned, and then presenting it, because it isn't research until it's been communicated to the public. And so the students have had a great experience in analyzing data, as well as communicating to the public the results of their research. I've been able to get involved in a project with Christian and Hanli Vinterbach on developing a guidebook on resolving human-wildlife conflicts in Southern Africa. And we've done a lot of the brainstorming work on this book, we tried to identify just 20 species, 20 key species we need to include, like lions, leopards, elephants, etc. And we sat down and in an afternoon, we came up with 50 species that we just have to include in this guidebook. And then it's a matter of identifying experts in the field who will write chapters for us to contribute to this guidebook, which then we will be able to pulse the information out to the people who live out in the veldt through various organizations like the World Wildlife Fund and others who work directly with the people on the landscape. In addition, we'll create a book because the people of European descent, the English, Dutch, Germans, Swiss, who still own land in these various areas of Southern Africa, they don't have access to public libraries. And so they are very proud of their own libraries. And so they buy a lot of books in Southern Africa. And through book sales, we'll be able to fund the conveyance and transmission of information in an extension outreach type mode to those people who really need that information. With that, I'd like to acknowledge all of those who have helped out with this project. And so Christian Winterbach is key, central to the figure here with Tau Consultants. He's my go-to guy in Southern Africa. His wife, Han Lee, Gail Potgieter, and Rob Thompson, who have been their field assistants to work in the field. And here's 3 of our student technicians that we have here. I'd also like to, and I want to thank all of the student technicians who and interns who have helped with the overall project. All the information they've generated and being able to convey this program has been invaluable. Also, the contributions of the Native people who work there, those who have served as trackers and drivers for us. Politic here is one in particular, an incredibly knowledgeable bushman who helped with a lot of the distance sampling work that we did in 1 year, and the people of his village who assisted us with all of the facilities and the actions, the field work that we do. You need to have support people to help you in all aspects here, and we really do thank all the people who've helped us in the field there in Southern Africa. With that, I'd like to open this up to questions if anyone has any. Reflect upon what we've talked a little bit about as far as the beautiful photos and images we have in Southern Africa. Also think about the complexities of human-wildlife conflicts and trying to work towards a point at which people can coexist with the wildlife that are there in Southern Africa. With that, I really do appreciate your time. I'm going to turn off, let's see, I'm going to get out of my sharing. Stop sharing here, coming back to the broad group so I can see some faces and see some chat. And I'd be happy to be able to answer any questions that you might have regarding Southern Africa.
Would you like me to read those off for you, Scott?
Yeah, please do, Jennifer.
Okay. So I'm going to start at the beginning here. And I think you may have answered this question, but it says it's a question from Alex Myers. I believe the Tsavo lions are now at the Field Museum in Chicago. Weren't they 2 males, but they also didn't have manes?
That's correct. Yeah, he's right on target. They are at the Field Museum at Chicago, and they were 2 males and they were maneless lions. Yeah, so they're likely younger males. The pride males, the older males that lead a pride, they're the ones that get the large flowing dark manes. So these were probably subordinates that just found a way of making a living off of people who were building a railroad.
Thank you. Is the movie, this is a question from Gerald LeMay, is the movie The Ghost in the Darkness based off this story? I'm not sure which story he's referring to, probably the Tsavo Lions. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, Ghost in the Darkness is a movie, and you can call it up on computer. I will say it's a pretty cool movie. Michael Douglas plays a role as a hunter. And so from there, they deviate from reality immediately. He isn't Colonel Patterson. He's a professional hunter. Well, Colonel Patterson didn't call in a professional hunter. He did it himself. And he wasn't really a very good hunter. As you read through his book, and it's only about, it's maybe a 50-page read. It's fascinating stuff, what he had to learn and what he had to go through trying to kill these 2 lions that were killing people working on his railroad. And he was successful in time, but it wasn't without some real foibles. And what's reflected in the movie, it is in parallel with mistakes that he made. He tried to lure the lions into a boxcar, and he almost got killed in doing so. He set up platforms out in trees and had the lions climb up into the trees. There was some spooky stuff that Colonel Patterson went through, and the movie is very, very compelling. And it deviates from reality somewhat, but it kind of stays a long track, and nonetheless, it's quite a fascinating watch.
So Alex has another question. Is there a significant difference between leopards from Africa and leopards found in Asia?
Well, personally, I don't know that much about leopards from Asia, but there's, some remarkable diversity there because we have snow leopards in Asia, for example, different subspecies of leopards there. As far as if you match them one-to-one, is there different in weights and reproduction, vital rates? I don't know enough about the leopards to tell you for sure. I do know something about leopards in Southern Africa, and the takeaway for me is that they're seemingly everywhere. I've spent hundreds of miles on the ground hunting and on photo safari, and I'll tell you, at most of the water holes that you encounter out in the veldt, there are leopard tracks. They're there. It's just you never see them. That's why I call them the silent stalker. So leopards are quite widely distributed. They're quite numerous, and they're not endangered at all like we have with our cheetah. They're very much a species of concern. With the lions, they're a species of concern, yes, but lion numbers are kind of holding, maybe declining somewhat. Cheetah are really in dire straits.
So we still have, it's 4:55. There's a couple of comments, but there's not any more questions yet. Betty Kay says, thank you for the informative and thought-provoking conversation. Nate Weisenbeck says, great presentation. And unfortunately, he has to leave to host the TWS meeting. So students, the TWS meeting will be starting shortly. But he says it feels good to relive some moments from his experiences in Africa. So thank you.
I'm a bit sorry for Nate for taking up all the time. When I start talking about Southern Africa, it's hard to stop. And I wanted Nate to be able to contribute, because he was just there in 2019. And I would have sent students over in 2020 as well. But guess what? We had a pandemic to deal with. But Nate was one of our great interns, and he and Tommy Young were incredible. I think they presented posters probably at 3 or 4 professional meetings. They made one professional presentation at our Wisconsin State Chapter meeting of the Wildlife Society. I mean, they took their information on elephant photogrammetry and really conveyed it out to the public and did a great job at it. So it was fun to see Nate here, and I know he has to pick up on the Wildlife Society Student Chapter meeting coming up very soon.
And there was one last comment from Alex, who had said he'd be more concerned about mambas or cobras as opposed to a puff adder. So you got to talk a little bit about that, but yeah.
You have a point there, and I've had a few instances with cobras. One was really cool in that I saw a group of 7 bat-eared foxes harassing a spitting cobra, and it was fascinating to watch the foxes trying to get at that cobra. Ultimately, the cobra found a hole and it got away from them, but it was really cool. You don't see cobras a lot. You don't see bat-eared foxes a lot. And here we saw them both at the same spot. The other case, I was way, way too close to a spitting cobra. I happened to step right across it. I was guiding 2 other hunters actually in Namibia, moving up on an oryx. We saw that it wasn't as big as I thought it maybe was. And then I looked around and I thought, wow, this looks like snaky country. It was rock, rubble type country. And it wasn't more than 100 yards from that spot that I was stepping over a chasm, and Tom Franklin, a friend of mine behind me, yelled, "Snake!" And at that moment, I looked down, there's a snake right between my legs, and I'm stepping right over it. And I leapt forward, he leapt back, and this snake just crawled out. It moved out about maybe 15 feet away from us, and it didn't hood up, like a cobra will. It just kind of laid out like this and was just trying to sense the environment, trying to figure out what we were. And we were scrambling to get glasses on because spitting cobras can spit about 15 feet. And trying to get glasses on, trying to get cameras out. And in the process, not a one of us got a picture of the animal before it crawled down into a chasm and got away. That was too close. But I guess, when you walk hundreds of miles, things like that happen. And well, I've been in auto accidents too over here, so relative risks.
Wow, really interesting. Yeah, that's a little too close for comfort for me too. Snakes don't bother me, but I like to give the venomous ones their distance.